Okay, well, I'm going to start now, I think, because there will be a few people coming and going, but they'll just miss me, and that's absolutely fine. So I would like to say that I'm Rachel Caswell. I'm part of the HACA2023 conference team, and I'd very much like to welcome you to the first ever Health and Care Analytics Conference. And today is the eLab learning event, Demand Forecasting for Executives and Professionals. If that's what you're expecting, you are in the right place. For the first time ever, the Health and Care Analytics Conference 2023 brings together hundreds of analysts currently working in health and care to celebrate, learn and be inspired with a packed program of expert speakers and workshops and poster presentations. We are turning analysts into influencers, leading the conversation and driving the change in health and care. And before I hand over to our host for today, I'd just like to remind you of a couple of things so that we can make the best of our time together. So please keep your mic muted during the session. Please introduce yourselves in the chat box. That's really important. The first one gets a prize. Use your chat box function to ask any questions and raise any tech issues. We are recording this session and it will be available afterwards, and we'll have that on the website. And please do tweet about today's session. You get prizes for that too. Prizes all over the place. So without further ado, I would now like to hand over to Professor Mohammed, who is a principal consultant in the strategy unit, and he is your host for today. Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So it's my great pleasure to be a host for a session which has 3 expert speakers from 3 different parts of the world who have collaborated in the domain of forecasting. I was particularly pleased to be the host today because Bahman has been someone who's been supporting the NHS for many years now with training on time series forecasting using R. And likewise, I'm aware now that Stefan and Enno have also been collaborating on supporting decision makers with insights and understanding on forecasting. So can I just go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to hand over. We have 3 speakers. I'm going to hand over to Bahman for an introduction, and then to drive the session. Please post your questions in the chat as we go along, and also worth bearing in mind that the authors who have joined us today have made the book available online on a Creative Commons license basis. So there's a link to that also in the chat. Bahman, over to you, please. Thank you.
Good morning, Mohammed. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us and for giving us this opportunity. So my name is Bahman, and I'm a reader in data and management science at Cardiff Business School, Cardiff University. And my work and research is around using data for social growth in general. In particular, I'm actually looking at forecasting for doing this. So I'll hand over to Stefan, maybe to present yourself.
All right, thank you very much. I'm Stefan Kolassa. I'm a data science expert at SAP Switzerland. So I'm not in academia. We create software. My main focus is on retail forecasting, but I also do a little academic and more general forecasting work on the side, mostly in the area of demand and supply chain forecasting. Enno.
Oh, thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I'm probably in the furthest time zone. I'm speaking from Madison, Wisconsin, so it's still kind of dark over here in the morning. I'm a faculty member in the Wisconsin School of Business, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and have studied forecasting for, oh, I don't know, better part of 20 years, I guess, in one form or the other. And yeah, very excited to be here and talk about our new book here on forecasting for executive and professionals.
All right. Enno, I don't know whether you want to maybe start with providing a sort of background about the book before we go into this new edition of Demand Forecasting for Executive and Professionals.
Sure, I'd be happy to. this book really started. Stefan and I met at a conference. I think it was 2014 or 2015, something along those lines. And I knew there were a lot of technical books on forecasting out there, and I felt there was a huge need to write something which is more managerial in nature. A lot of people deal with forecasts without being forecasters themselves, and we needed to provide resources to help them better understand what is a forecast, where does it come from, how do we use it. And so Stefan and I got together and wrote an earlier version of this book back in 2016. That was still sort of published under the normal rules of the game. So it's still a book which is out there and you can buy it. But Bachmann approached us, I think it was around about 2020, and basically said, look, we need to do two things. We need to first of all, I think Bachmann, you really loved the book, but it was a bit outdated by then. The past 5 to 10 years have seen tremendous advances in forecasting through machine learning, and these advances had to be reflected in the book. And second of all, I think you kind of pushed us to say, why not make it available in some version for free, because then it is accessible and can be used for educational purposes much more broadly. And I think Stefan and I immediately agreed to that. And so we created this new version of the book called Demand Forecasting for Executives and Professionals, which is it's already available for free on the website. The link is in the chat, and it will be, if you still want to buy a hard copy as well, and you'll be able to do so by the end of the summer.
Wonderful. I will just add to this. Actually, I was teaching a module for a healthcare planning diploma, which is delivered in Cardiff Business School for NHS Wales. And I was using the first version of the book. And as Enno mentioned, I thought this is a fantastic book, but it needs to be updated. But also, it would be better if you can make it online. It could be accessible across the world. And thus, I sent a proposal, and then they kindly agreed actually with me being on board to write this new version of the book as well. Stefan, do you want to add anything here before we go into the agenda of the presentation?
No, absolutely not, beyond the fact that you two have been wonderful co-authors.
Great.
That's important. Okay. Go ahead.
Lovely. So this is the agenda of what we are going to cover today. We start with discussing about why actually we do forecasting and its importance in planning and decision making. Following that, we're looking at forecasting workflow, so the sort of step we need to go through from like identifying a decision to basically communicate the forecast for use to inform decisions. We look at a simple example of how we do that and how we produce a forecast. And following that, we look at how important it is to understand your data and what we need actually to do there. And then we look at the different components we may have in a time series that needs to be incorporated in forecasting methods. And then following that, we look at a broad range of forecasting methods. So we provide an overview of them, following by how we evaluate the performance of the forecasting models. We then discuss the ideal forecaster. If you have a forecasting team, what actually attributes we discuss for an ideal forecaster. So we also discuss some organizational aspect of forecasting. And then finally, we discuss some topics around when forecasting may fail, or at least seem to be fail. So, Enno, it's to you.
Thank you. So this is, I think, a motivational slide that I, in one version of the other, use all the time when I teach forecasting and executive education. And it's really to sensitize, to say, every plan needs a forecast. The reason why, the three of us engaged in this topic is really, we believe hugely in the importance of forecasting. Every planning tool, every model, anything which allows you to, better plan your operations, better understand how to utilize resources requires some forecast. And a forecast by the way, is nothing magic, right? I mean, we sort of have this image of you go to the Oracle of Delphi and it gives you some sort of cryptic version of the future. That's not what we're talking about over here. Forecast is really just an estimate of a probability distribution, right? So the first important point, it's a probability distribution, right? There's nothing deterministic about demand. We don't know what demand is going to be, 1 hour from now, 1 day from now, 1 week from now. All of these are predictions, which means it's really a probability distribution that we're trying to estimate. And forecasting tools are nothing but, methods that allow us to integrate all the information that we have into that estimation of a probability distribution. That's really how you should think about forecasting. And I've met so many executives who've grown frustrated about forecasting because they've seen forecasts not work out, right? Predictions being awfully wrong. That happens. Again, you're estimating a probability distribution. Sometimes you're doing things right. Sometimes things don't work out. The important part is first of all, not to just question, say forecasts are right or wrong. The question is the process good or not, right? Do you have a good forecasting process? But the second important part is like you can't get rid of forecasting. There are people out there who basically say, we just stopped forecasting. We plan otherwise right now, and that's really there's an element of nonsense to that, right? Whatever you do, you need a forecast. You can move to operational models that are built on more stable demand, or that sort of adjust to demand. But there's an underlying assumption about what happens to demand. And so forecasting, you cannot completely get rid of it. You can minimize your dependence on forecasts, and there's ways of how you can buffer against uncertainty. You can hedge against uncertainty, etc. So there are many operational decisions you can do to reduce the volatility and the impact of forecasting and demand uncertainty on your operations, but you cannot get rid of it. You need somebody in the organization who understands what happens to demand and who helps you integrate all the information you have into a proper forecast. Next slide.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna. All right, so producing forecast is typically a iterative process involving different steps that are summarized in this flowchart in the right-hand side. So here we put 10 steps. It might be more or less, depending on actually what you do. The flowchart starts with one important step that is often, in my opinion, overlooked. And again, this is based on my experience in working with different organizations as well. So the first step is to identify a decision that requires a forecast. So often when I do training, even I ask people, okay, you produce this forecast, but how you're going to use it? And well, the question is simple and looks really straightforward, but we don't really sometimes have an answer for it. And that means probably we didn't identify as a first step the decision that requires a forecast, and we are too enthusiastic about data analysis and doing the modeling part, and we just digging into that without knowing how the forecast is going to be used. So this is the first important step. Often we have one or maybe multiple reasons actually to do the forecast. So for each decision that we identify that requires a forecast, we need to go through the rest of this flowchart. So the second step is to determine forecasting requirements. So for the decision, we have to, there are certain number of things here. We have to identify like what is the forecast variable or the thing that you want to forecast, how far into the future you want to forecast, how often you produce the forecast, what is the temporal granularities that you are interested in to inform the decision, and is there any other sort of structure like a hierarchical structure or a grouping structure. For instance, you may want to forecast for a particular group of customers or age groups, or maybe for the entire hierarchy from a total country into, let's say, different hospitals, if you talk about the healthcare in the bottom of that hierarchy. So that, again, is not possible without identifying the decision, right? So it is important to have this two steps together. So once we identify the decision and then determining the requirements, we go and collect data and information. And then here, there are at least 4 important sources of data that we need to have. The first one is the time series data. So basically, if you forecast a variable, you go and collect the historical record of that in the past over a number of years. The second source of information is what we call a deterministic predictor. Basically, is a driving factor of the forecast variable, but it has a deterministic nature. It means we know its value in the future. An example of this could be public holidays, or it could be promotions in retail industry, for instance. The third source of information could be stochastic predictors. So again, these are the driving factors of the forecast.
Sorry, Bahman, can I check? Are you moving? Are you on another slide, or are you still on the?
No, just I'm the same slide yet.
Right. Yeah. And can I just ask? I think some
Sure.
people here will be interested in knowing a little bit more about what is meant by deterministic forecast. Yeah. Just say a little bit about that, because I think that's a really important entry point.
Yeah, so the deterministic basically term that we use we use the deterministic predictor. Basically, it's a predictor that we know its value in advance. So the example of this is the public holidays. So from now into next any number of years, I know when is Christmas, I know when is New Year's Day. So these are deterministic, and I know their value for sure, right? That is what we call as a deterministic, right? And the stochastic predictor is the one that we identify it as an important driving factor of forecast, but we don't know its value for sure. An example of a stochastic predictor could be population, or could be weather temperature, for instance, right? So again, depending on how we use this predictor, you may need to get an estimation for these predictors into the future as well. And the final source of information that we need is actually expertise of key personnel in our organization. This is something that we use probably later as a judgmental forecast, where we may adjust the forecast. So once we collect this information, the next step that we need to go through is to prepare data for our forecasting. And this often is actually done with step 5, which is visualizing data, because here we want to make sure the data is in the right format for forecasting, but also it is the quality of the data is right for our analysis. And this is, again, we can do it through different steps in 4 and 5 to help us, but also step 5 is used to identify the systematic information, like systematic pattern that we have in our data. And following that, we go and choose and train models on the data. And here, typically, we choose multiple models to train on our data. So training, again, here means estimating parameters of the data. And then in step 7, we produce the forecast in the form of probability distribution, or a prediction interval, or a point forecast. And then in step 8, we evaluate its performance or its quality. And quality can have different dimension. We'll talk about it later, but here we want to ensure that our forecast didn't fail capturing, or our forecasting model didn't fail capturing systematic information, but also didn't overfit, right? So depending on whether we can improve the forecast accuracy or not, we may actually stop here, or we may go back to the step 3 and the rest of the process. Or if we stop, we come to step 9, and here we communicate the forecast. And communication can have also 2 important dimensions. First, what we have to communicate, and then second, how we have to communicate it. And then when it comes to what we need to communicate, again, it could be in different form, but it could be maybe a quantile. It could be also maybe the business impact of the forecast that we need to communicate. But in terms of the format of it, generally using a good visualization could be very helpful here. The final step in our flowchart is a possible adjustment of the forecast. So sometimes we may have a reason to change the output of a statistical model. For instance, you may believe that a new information just comes out, and the model that we use didn't capture this information because it is not in the historical data, and because of that, you may adjust the forecast. Or you may believe that some information has not been captured by the model, even if it's not new, and then we, based on that, we may adjust the forecast, and this would be used to inform the decision. So this summarizes the most important steps that we need to go through from identifying a decision to basically produce a forecast and communicate it to inform the decision.
All right. Just I think you can already just present the whole slide at once, and then we don't need to go through iterations. Something we do quite often throughout the book is break things into simple examples. I mean, we really wrote this book with you know, sort of a non-technical audience in mind, and so oftentimes we have kind of very simple kind of examples and methods that we walk through to illustrate concepts. And here's sort of we wanted to walk you through one forecast essentially, just to kind of see how forecasting methods work and how you would use that forecast for decision making. So you see on the very top, you see a time series, right? So this is a sequence of data points going from earliest on the left to most recent on the right. And that's sort of the very basic data you have available in time series forecasting. As Bahman mentioned, you might have additional predictors, but you'll always start with some kind of time series, some understanding of what happened previously. This is a simulated time series, just to make things a little bit easier, but it's quite representative of many time series out there. And if you look at this time series, again, the graph at the very top, you'd be asking like, okay, if I had to make a prediction for the next point in the time series, right? That's really what you do in forecasting. You're trying to understand what's happening next. How would I go about it? And you see that the series, you know, first of all, it's not entirely random, right? There's some kind of level or a center of the series that you can identify, but there's also a lot of zigzag, which is really noise, right? There's sort of things that occur in one time period that don't seem to reoccur. So this is a relatively noisy time series. You know, let's say two very simple strategies for creating a forecast would be to say, well, we could just take the most recent observation, right? So I don't know, somewhere around 3,300, maybe we would say, well, maybe that's going to happen again. But we might feel somewhat uncomfortable about that because, you know, again, this is a very noisy time series. The most recent observation might be a very unusual one, and maybe you don't want to use that for a prediction, right? You could also say, well, you know, maybe we'll just do a long run average, right? We take all of these data points and average them and make that our prediction. That's probably somewhere around 2,500. And again, that's a perfectly valid strategy as well, but you kind of get the sense in this time series that it shifted a little bit, right? So maybe the earlier points are a little bit lower than the more recent points. And so maybe more recent data is a little bit more valid in terms of making a prediction. So long run average also seems kind of perfectly valid, but maybe not the right thing to do. And it turns out that, you know, in this case, the actual right thing to do is somewhere in between these two approaches, the most recent data point versus a long-term average. And that's a technique called exponential smoothing. It's a technique we've known for quite a long time. It's a very effective technique for time series forecasting. And it's really, you can think about it as a mixture between taking, you know, it takes all data into account, but it really puts a little bit more emphasis on the more recent data. So you can think about it as an average or a weighted average of data points that automatically attributes higher weights to more recent data. And that would be the right thing to do for this kind of time series, actually. We know that because we, again, generated this time series. And, you know, when you do that, you kind of know what the optimal forecasting method is. And in this case, it is exponential smoothing. Key thing is that gives us what is called a point forecast. And a point forecast is a single number. You know, the point forecast here might be something like 3,000. And, you know, on the one hand, that's easy to understand. On the other hand, really point forecasts are kind of ridiculous because we know it's not going to be, demand in the next time period is not going to be exactly 3,000. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. And so one thing we emphasize throughout the book, and I emphasize throughout my teaching as well, is you really have to move your mindset away from point forecasting. Point forecasting gives you one point in the probability distribution, right? Usually it's the center. Usually, depending on what error measure you use, it's the mean of the distribution. Sometimes it's the mode, but you know, you have to move your mindset away from that, because there's a whole lot of other things that could happen, and a good forecasting method should communicate that. And we've done that in the graphs sort of below the top one and the middle one. We've plotted prediction intervals. You know, you see sort of the center line over there. That would be the dotted line in the middle graph. That is your point forecast actually for the next couple of periods. You might sort of feel a little bit odd. The point forecast is actually constant over here, because this is a time series without a trend and without seasonality, and that means your point forecast becomes sort of constant over time. And then you see prediction intervals, which are usually, you know, cover sort of 90% of the probability distribution, right? It gives you a sense for what are sort of, in some sense, best case and worst case scenarios. How high could demand be? How low could demand be? And you see the prediction intervals actually slightly increasing over time, which sort of reflects the fact that the further we predict out into the future, the more uncertainty there is in forecasts, right? Or you could look at the lower graph, where we actually use what is called a predictive density, and we've kind of sort of superimposed a normal distribution over here that gives you a sense for, okay, beyond the point forecast of one particular prediction, how does the probability distribution of demand actually look like? How much, what is the density, or essentially the likelihood of demand becoming very high versus very low, right? So these are ways of communicating the uncertainty behind forecasts. And really, if you are serious about using forecasts for decision making, you need to know what the uncertainty of a forecast is. If you work with point forecasts, it's very hard to really understand what scenarios you need to hedge against, what the possible upside and downside is. And so once you move to a world where you have either prediction intervals or predictive densities, it's much easier to understand, you know, how should you set service levels. So in a healthcare context, for example, if you use forecasting for scheduling, you need to understand whether you need to provide extra resources or set aside extra time for any kind of planned surgeries, etc. Right? Those are things you can only do if you understand the inherent uncertainty behind a forecast. Next slide.
All right. So when you build or you want to build forecasting models, and this goes back basically to step 4 and 5 in the flowchart, probably the most important thing is you need to understand basically your data well. Well, if you are working in academia, probably this is not a big deal, because we can still, you know, fit models into the data and publish without knowing exactly what's happening with the time series. But I have never came across, you know, an example in practice where I can just simply apply a model into data and works perfectly in practice. And this is where domain knowledge becomes fundamental. So domain knowledge probably is key here to help you understand your data. And of course, if you have the domain knowledge, perfect. If you don't have it, you need to make sure actually you have someone in your team with the domain knowledge that can help you to understand your data. So the starting point could be plotting, you know, some sort of time series graphics to help you understand your data, but also check, you know, different aspects of data quality. And we recommend to use different sort of time series graphics or data visualizations, because each of them may help you to reveal some sort of surprising or unusual aspect of the data that you haven't seen in others. For instance, you might you know, look for some sort of systematic pattern or seasonality. Is it obvious from, you know, a time plot or a seasonal plot or a sub-series plot or not? Can we see trend clearly from this plot or not? We are looking for drivers to help us to explain the variation or to help us basically to build a forecasting model to forecast accurately. That's basically what we're trying to do here. So there are two aspects, as I said, to knowing your data. First is to check the data quality and make sure this is the right data that can help you to build a forecasting model. And the second one is to identify the systematic patterns in the data, like trend, seasonality, any sort of extreme value or peak or throw that you see in the data, and whether you can explain them. Because as Eno highlighted, building models is not really magic. Building models is all about understanding what is happening and how you can incorporate them into your model. So in the right-hand side, you see basically three examples of the time plot. The first at the top is just simulated data. So in the left one, you have a time series that is quite smooth and probably easy to forecast. And in the right-hand side one, again, it is something probably with less sort of systematic information that could be helpful in forecasting. In the middle, you have a time series or the time plot of an ambulance demand. Again, this is difficult to see a lot of things here, but we can probably see some sort of systematic repetitions, but also we can see some extreme values here, very low or very high. And of course, we need to go and understand what happens here. If I look at the more like high or aggregated level of this data, and I plot it here in the third one. So in the x-axis, I have hour of the day, and in y-axis, I have the demand for the service. And then I also use the different, this is a different abbreviation or names for different day of the week. So this reveals some aspect of the data that I couldn't probably see in the time plot, or even I look at a seasonal or sub-series plot, I wouldn't be able to see it. For instance, you can clearly see between midnight and early morning, the demand for a Saturday and Sunday is higher than the rest of the week. Or if you look at, for instance, from 8 p.m. towards midnight, here again, you see another interesting aspect of the data where you have Saturday and then followed by Friday with higher demand compared to the rest of the week. But what is interesting, if you look at the middle, most of the time you see Monday followed by Friday, they have actually the highest demand. All right, so if you look at just the time series part of our data, because again, as I said, that the data that we collect could be predictors, but it could be also the time series that we look at. So classical time series forecasting models consider different components like level and trend, seasonality, autoregression, moving average components, and reminder. So we can think of the trend as something that describes the predictable increase or decrease over time, and seasonality as a consistent pattern that repeats over a fixed period of time. And actually, this fixed period of time is very important in seasonality. We can see or observe a similar shape every 24 hours in a day, or every 7 days in a week, or even every 365 days in a year, or something similar. It is important also to note that you may have more than one type of seasonality in our time series. This is typically what we call multiple seasonal cycles, like the within day and within week. If we have them both in a sub-daily or hourly time series, then we are dealing with two types of seasonality in our modeling. So another important component that you may have in a time series is autoregression, which relies on the previous observation, and moving average component. This shouldn't be confused, by the way, by moving average as a forecasting method. So moving average component here refers to the previous errors made by a forecasting model that is used. You may have also a component called reminder, and this reminder sometimes could be sometimes could conclude only random variation, but sometimes we may have also some systematic information left in the reminder. And a good way actually to see this is using decomposition. So you may have a time series, as you see at the top, so we can decompose it into different components, including trend and seasonality. And if you have multiple seasonalities, then you see actually another plot for different type of seasonality. And then at the end, you have the reminder. So sometimes the reminder includes some systematic information, because if it is not trend and seasonality, I don't know, it could be something like maybe some information related to temperature, or some information related to public holidays or promotion, for instance. So this is also a good way to go and look at if there is any association between the reminder and some causal predictors or drivers that you may have in a forecasting model. Stefan?
Wonderful, thank you very much. Okay, so we are not going to inflict all the different forecasting methods on you in this call, because you wouldn't learn very much anyways. If you're interested, please do take a look at the book, and where we go into details. There's also a lot of technical stuff out there, so we're not really all that interested in the technical details of the different methods. Plus, there's a few methods that one knows, and the main differentiation between the different forecasting methods is really, on the one hand, the interpretability and the complexity. To a degree, also the accuracy and the possibility of modeling drivers and causal effects. I've been having a little conversation in the chat box about modeling drivers, and some of these methods can deal with them and some not. We already mentioned simple methods like the mean forecast or the naive forecast, the naive being just forecast the last observation out for the future. That is a very naive method, and these two often work surprisingly well. Also, rolling averages. We've had somebody in the chat ask about rolling averages. This is essentially something between the mean and the naive. These are very good benchmarks. In the plot on the right, you also see the seasonal naive forecast that says just forecast the last seasonal observation out. So if you want to forecast for next January, use last January's observation as your forecast. That's a seasonal forecast. These work really well. Of course, they can't deal with drivers, causal drivers. There's also classical methods like exponential smoothing, which Enno also mentioned. There's ARIMA, autoregressive weighted moving average. These are the workhorses of forecasting, you could say, and these are still quite understandable. ARIMA a little less so, exponential smoothing more so. They still, in their pure implementations, cannot model causals. So if we have strong drivers like temperatures, more heat strokes during heat waves, and more cold deaths during particularly cold winters, things like these, then we might look to stuff like linear regression, which is still rather simple to understand and to communicate. We've also had a conversation about communicating the forecasts. Somebody who may not be technical, not be very statistically proficient, but who may need to understand the forecasts in a way they can make a decision. You can do that with a linear regression. After that, we come to the more, call them modern methods. There's methods like tree-based approaches, regression trees, random forests. You can also boost them. Boosting is typically implemented using trees, but could also be done with other methods. Boosting is really a heuristic meta method. There's also neural networks and deep learning. And in deep learning, of course, there's a plethora of different possibilities of different architectures of setting up your neural network. And these all have in common that they're highly complex, very hard to understand, very hard to communicate. It's very hard to understand where the forecast comes from that you're feeding to somebody. And if the forecast goes wrong, then it's kind of hard to understand why is it going wrong, and how do I deal with it? How do I ensure that this kind of wrongness doesn't recur? And also these more modern methods typically use much more resources, be it runtime, typically in modeling, fitting the model, that takes a lot longer than for the older methods. Also in terms of processing power, of storage space, electricity use, also in terms of data science expertise. All right, and finally, of course, there's always human judgment that always comes in, and that's sometimes hardest to understand of all. Can you go to the next slide, please, Bachmann? Okay, forecast quality evaluation. Now we have a forecast. How do we decide whether that's any good? And there's a huge variety of different accuracy measures. You can measure point forecast accuracy, but as you have heard from Enno, we are not big fans of point forecast accuracy, point forecasts as such. We prefer interval forecasts or anything that gives you an idea of the variability, of the uncertainty that we still have around the forecast. So how can we assess that? Well, there's pinball losses for quantile forecasts. There's interval scores for interval forecasts. There's proper scoring rules for density forecasts. And please note that we have refrained from putting any formula in there because, yeah, as I said, you can read all that in the book. Can you go on, please? Just one click. The problem with the accuracy measures is that, and that is actually something that's my particular hobby horse, it's something that's perhaps not appreciated as much as it should be. These can be actively misleading, especially if you have an intermittent demand forecast, so one that is often 0 and sometimes 1 or 2, but very often zeros. Or if you have a highly variable series, then some of these measures, some of these classical method measures like the mean absolute error, mean absolute percentage error can be misleading in the sense that giving an intentionally biased forecast can make these accuracy measures look better. Can you click, please, Bachmann? Just as an example, this is simulated data, this is gamma distributed, and I put in a density just to help people visualize what's happening. And we have 3 different forecasts going out. These are 3 lines of varying dashiness. And the key thing about this here, you can go to the link if you're interested in the gory details. The key thing about this here is that these 3 forecasts can all be optimal depending on your accuracy measure. So the accuracy measure really has an impact on what forecast is optimal. So the key thing to draw out of this is it is important to think about what kind of accuracy measure you want to use. There is often a conversation about external benchmarks. How good are your forecasts? How good are my forecasts? Oh, my forecasts are less accurate than yours are. I need to learn something from you, or the other way around. These are external benchmarks, and these are very bad. These are worse than meaningless. These can be very misleading too, because you can both be doing the very best you can if the difference is just that one person's or one organization's forecast time series are harder to forecast than another's. And even if you say, well, we all forecast ambulance demand, we all forecast the same thing on the same granularity, daily ambulance demand, how different can that be? The answer is very different. If you're in rural Wales, you'll be much harder pressed to give out a good forecast than if you're in central London, simply because in central London, there is so much more data happening. There's so much more, and so the variability gets progressively lower. So comparing external benchmarks is very, very hard, and I would really very much recommend not to do that. Much better to benchmark on processes. Are we doing the best forecasting process that we can? Not are we achieving the same accuracy as our neighbor down the road? One more click, please. Okay, and finally, that's one thing that should always be kept in mind. Better accuracy does not necessarily mean better outcomes. There is slowly the academics coming to the realization that the forecast, after all, it's there to support a decision like safety stock calculation or capacity calculation. How many vaccines should we stockpile? If your forecast gets better, then that means we may have a higher accuracy, a lower MAPE, whatever. That does not necessarily mean that you have a better outcome at the end. You may still, because of batch sizes, because of logistical constraints, you may have the exact same final outcome from a worse as from a better forecast. And in cases like this, it's really questionable. Do we really need to invest in improving the forecast, or should we use these resources elsewhere? One more click, Bachmann, please. Okay, that's actually my final slide. This is just a little visualization of what the perfect forecaster is. So, because why do we have something like this in the book? The book is not only geared towards the forecasters. The idea is really it also aims at the manager of forecasts, at people who interact with forecasters, who need to understand the forecasters, and who may be in a position to hire forecasters. So what should people look for in the perfect forecaster? Well, themselves being forecasters and trying to develop as a professional forecaster, or in terms of hiring a perfect forecaster. And we believe there's 4 dimensions to this. And in the middle, you see the statistics and the programming part. These are almost no-brainers. Nowadays, many people who do forecasting come from a data science perspective or possibly a statistics perspective. There's so many data science boot camps out there. So many people play around with neural networks before breakfast. Statistics and programming is pretty much the bedrock on which forecasting very often happens. However, what is also hugely important is an understanding of communication, because once you've calculated or built your forecast or used your highly sophisticated software package to calculate a forecast, you need to communicate that to somebody who consumes a forecast and makes decisions either based on that forecast, or if you were not successful in convincing them, they'll be using their own forecast. They may not call it a forecast, they may call it something else, but whether or not they leverage your forecast and whether or not your forecast actually drives an improvement in the process, in the subsequent process, depends hugely on whether you communicated it well. And that comes down to stuff like explaining why the forecast is the way it is, understanding the needs, and understanding how much people understand about the forecast, understanding whether people are comfortable with a flatline forecast. To take a very simple example, is that something that people will understand or not? And how do we deal with the fact that people may not trust our forecast? And finally, on the right-hand side, we see business. And that is really shorthand for domain knowledge. It's not only for profit business that people should understand. People should really understand the larger context in which they're forecasting. They need to understand what their forecast will be used for, because otherwise I might be forecasting something completely wrong. Perhaps they're forecasting hourly demand for vaccines, although it's being replenished on a monthly basis, and you don't need hourly demand. Then you need a monthly forecast. And so completely just understanding what they're forecasting for, or knowing what whether spikes in the data could conceivably be explained by drivers, by causal effects, and whether these should be modeled or not. If I look at pharmaceutical data, I'd probably just be blinking my eyes and not seeing anything in there and not understanding what's happening here. Whereas somebody with domain knowledge might be able to say, well, something happened here, something else happened here. We can model that, and this is a spike that we don't understand, that we can't model. So, and for that, you really need domain knowledge. All right, thank you. Next on the next slide. I think that is NO.
Me? Ah, I thought it was Bachmann. But very good. I think most manufacturing organizations have developed processes around forecasting. And this usually happens in the context of what is called sales and operations planning. And the key point is really one of coordination. If you think about it, a forecast is, not only a planning tool in some sense, or something that helps you in planning, it's also a coordination mechanism. Organizations have to plan around, similar values, and the forecast helps really, keep decision makers across the organization aligned. And for that purpose, again, there are these sales and operations planning processes that are supposed to make everybody in the organization, create their plans based off the same forecast. And that requires a consensus around a forecast, right? So the first thing you have to kind of be really aware about is, there's still plenty of organizations out there who have basically 3 forecasts for the same thing, and 3 parts of the organization using different forecasts to basically plan around the same thing. And so you need a mechanism in the organization that forces people to align and agree on the same forecast and use the same forecast for decision making. That is very important. Again, in manufacturing organizations, this is called sales and operations planning. In service organizations, this is usually, a lot less sophisticated. I've seen very few service organizations that have the same kind of discipline around forecasting here. And really, there's a huge threat here to validity of sort of an organizational forecasting processes, because forecasts, of course, are often political tools, right? So, you know, if I'm classic example is if I'm in work in sales, then I could, for example, want the forecasts to be really, really low so I can easily beat them because I know that my goals and targets are based on that forecast, and I can really shine if I beat the forecast in sales, right? Or if I'm in a manufacturing side of the organization, I might have different incentives about the forecast. So forecasts are often political, and different decision makers will want to influence that, right? And so there are sort of problematic incentives, and you need to, as an organization, deal with these incentives. There are also individual biases, right? So you put a group of people into a room and have them look at the same data, and they'll come up with very different answers with respect to what they think happens with demand. Sometimes that's good because, again, sometimes sort of this kind of diversity helps really, you know, understand and brings out patterns that are there and brings out key things you need to know about your time series. But at other times, you know, there are a lot of individual biases that can go into forecasting. Couple of examples here are anchoring, right? So we are often anchored on very recent data, and we take that as a base for a judgment and insufficiently adjust from that. That's a very, very classic bias in decision making. Representativeness is another one. We expect the series of forecasts that we create to look like the series of demand that we observe. And that's actually wrong, because the series of demand contains a lot of noise. Good forecasting methods basically filter out the noise. And so the series of forecasts that we create looks a lot less noisy than you know, the series of demand data. And again, people can get sort of hung up on that. So this gives you just sort of a few examples of both individual biases and organizational biases that can influence the forecasting process. And if you think about forecasting organization, these are things you need to very actively address in the process. Next slide.
All right. I'm sure if you do forecasting, you know that sometimes it is easy to be frustrated with the forecasting process, and sometimes disappointed as well. And sometimes you may feel, oh, forecasting seems actually to fail. It's not really helpful. So I'd like actually to show you one example. This is the demand for a service industry. Well, it's a demand actually for tourism industry in Australia. And so in y-axis, you have the demand, and in x-axis, you have the months. And if you look at the black side, which is the actual data or time series, basically, this is just a part of the time series. It is a bit longer than this. But, you know, you see this sort of systematic information that goes into this. There is a perfect seasonality there. And in forecasting, again, we are interested in capturing this systematic information to incorporate into the model, and we project into the future. Now, I would love to have time actually for a poll and ask you what you think about the accuracy of this forecasting model. But I think most of you know what happened during this period of time here. And then if I show you basically these are the forecasts. The blue line is the point forecast, and then these are the fan charts basically. And here you have 50% and 80% prediction interval here as well. And here we go. So, and what is really interesting here is if you look at the black and blue line, it seems like the model that we use here could capture pretty well what happens, or the actual comparing the blue with the black, and also most of the time this is within the 80% prediction interval. But something, well, here happened. COVID-19 completely changed the way people travel, and we couldn't travel, of course, at that time. And this is basically completely wrong. And this is where it seems like forecasting fails, because the forecasting is doing what it's supposed to do. It captures the information, which is strong seasonality, and use it to forecast the future. But the problem is now we have some new information that is not available actually in the data. So the model doesn't know anything about COVID. So it kept actually doing that, what is supposed to do. But the reality was completely different. So future was containing information that was not represented in the past data. And that brings me to an important discussion of why does forecasting fail, or whether actually forecasting fails or not. Now, before looking at some important topics or points around why forecasting may fail, I think it is important to recognize that we make decisions, right? And in the light of decisions, we make plan, and to successfully plan, we need to have an estimation. Whatever you call it, you may call it an estimation, a projection, sometimes just a gut feeling, but you have an estimation of something that you rely on to make decisions and plan accordingly. And this is basically what we call a forecast. So there is no alternative, really. So the question is not really whether to forecast or not, because there is no choice. We have to forecast, but the question would be more, I think, important to focus on the process that to generate effectively the forecasting. Now, if I go back basically to this plot, what happened, why this actually failed here? Because it is important to recognize what we can forecast, or it is important to know about the forecastability of the data. In this case, and in many cases, in forecasting modeling, we assume that future and past resemble. So if we have a future that is completely different from the past, well, the models wouldn't be able to forecast accurately, and it seems like it's failing there. But again, we need to be aware of that assumption that they are there. If you are dealing with like a time series, well, there is a lot of random fluctuations. Well, it is unlikely that you can get an accurate forecast for it, or you have you don't have a good understanding of driving factors to help you understand the variation in the model and incorporate them in the model. Again, it is unlikely that you can get you know, a forecasting model that is very helpful there. So it is important to be aware of, you know, what we can and we can't forecast, and these are some factors that we can consider there. We may also rely too much on the point forecast, and again, the point forecast doesn't actually acknowledge uncertainty, and it actually gives us an illusion of certainty. And if you rely on this to make a decision, well, the decision certainly would be wrong. So we need also to be aware of that. So another important thing is there is a limit to improve forecast accuracy, right? So I always have a conversation with people in NHS, you know, asking me, they receive, let's say, emails from consultants asking them, or from startups telling them that they have latest AI and they can improve their forecast accuracy about 80%, whatever that 80% means. Whether it is possible or not, well, I don't know. It depends on those factors, like what we can forecast. It might be possible, but you may also have a limit to improve that. So you need to be aware of that. And it is important also during the forecasting workflow, as you go through, you know, these different steps, and based on the domain knowledge, you may identify factors that help you to improve it. But if it doesn't improve, you need to think about it. Maybe you have actually reached that level as well. So another important thing is sometimes you may confuse forecasts with targets or decisions or a plan. So we need to make sure these are different, right? So target is something that's set in organization to drive motivation or coordinate different activities. But it is not a forecast, right? It's something different. The forecast might be close or not to that. And sometimes in organization we need to hit the forecast. So if that is the case, it means there is a misunderstanding there. A forecast is not a decision as well, because we make a decision in the light of the forecast, right? And it is not a plan as well, because we plan certain actions based on, you know, the forecast we generate, but also the target we have, and also the sort of decision that we make. So we need to make sure we don't confuse these four things. Sometimes we may complain a lot about the forecasting is not good, but we don't really track the quality of the forecast over time. Or maybe we don't have an appropriate error measure at first place to evaluate the quality, but also track it over time and see why it is not actually good. Is there any reason? Is there anything the model misses, and can we incorporate it into the modeling, or maybe, as I said, maybe it is as it is and we can't really do something about it. So another important factor to consider here is about data availability and data quality. So sometimes you may, based on the domain knowledge, you may guess that there is a predictor that could be very helpful to be incorporated in your model, but maybe you don't have data for that predictor. So it is really useless to have the discussion around it because you haven't maybe collected it at all, or it is not available. Sometimes, even if you have some sort of predictors available to help you to build a model, but the quality of those predictors might not be good, and it is maybe not helpful as well to include them. So even if it seems like there are driving factors that help you, but because you don't have good data for it, it is not helpful to build a model. And then finally, you may also have too much judgmental intervention. So when we produce the forecast, again, we do it because we want to inform decisions, and informing decisions could be maybe automatic or it could be manual. So by manual, I mean we present the forecast in a meeting to people, and then there is a discussion around it. And this is what I have seen in many cases. And sometimes there are a lot of interventions by, changing the forecast to make it a bit higher or lower without really a specific reason. So if there are too many interventions as well, that could actually make the forecast worse. Sometimes even we make interventions about something that has already been incorporated into the models. So we need also to avoid actually doing this sort of thing there. And I think, so we actually reached the end of our presentation. What is this? All right. So thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, if there is a question, I think there are a couple of questions.
Can I just take the opportunity to thank our speakers? But there has been lots of discussions in the chat. Perhaps one thing that interested me was the comparison or the notion of kind of some organizations embedding quite sophisticated forecasting methodology to support their decision making, and that's not kind of seen in across a number of other sectors maybe. So what does high quality decision kind of high quality forecasting look like in an organization? I think that would be quite interesting for the National Health Service colleagues to hear about. Would anybody care to take that as a quick question? You have highlighted some of those points, Barman, I think, but I thought the comparison with manufacturing, for example, was interesting.
I think I will maybe start with a point, and Stefan and Enno can add more. I think the most important point is if you produce a forecast, you need to make sure how it is going to be used. So if you don't know or it is unclear, you need to actually work on it first before going to the modeling part. Because as we discussed, understanding that will actually change entirely the process that you go through, including the modeling, how you build it, but also how you evaluate the forecast accuracy, etc. So I think that is the most important thing from that point of view. And assuming that this is done properly, another important point is we need to make sure the forecast we generate acknowledge uncertainty. So at least we need to accompany a point forecast with a prediction interval. Well, ideally, we should go to the probabilistic forecast where we have the full distribution. But again, in my opinion, there are a lot of issues around how we use it in practice. I haven't seen like any good example of how this could be used because maybe sometimes actually the decision-making process is not used, even if you produce a probabilistic forecast or density forecast, but the decision-making process is not in place really to use it. So the second point is make sure the forecast acknowledge uncertainty and ideally is presented as a density forecast. So maybe Stefan and Enno can add also anything there.
It's very hard to add anything to your excellent remarks there, Bachmann. I would say one key thing is that the forecast adjacent function must understand what a forecast is and what the limitations of the forecast are, because you can communicate your density forecast as much as you want. If people don't understand what that is and why you can't just come up with one number, they will disregard your forecast. And a wonderful forecast is worthless if people don't trust it and don't use it. So I think the key aspect is to have processes that actually leverage the forecast, because a density forecast is also useless if the subsequent process doesn't use it in any way. So have processes that leverage the good forecasts that you calculate, and have people and decision makers that understand what a forecast is, what it can do, and what it cannot do. And I guess that's a tall order. It's something it's hard to educate people who really are not forecasters, because they're doing something else, but that's the ideal world. And what I see out there is I'm mainly focused on retailers, and I see that the larger retailers like the Amazons and the Walmart of this world, and the Tesco's, for instance, we're in the UK, they have dedicated forecasting teams that are very well integrated within operations, and they talk to their counterparts, and people understand each other. And I think they actually do an extremely good job at that. Of course, they're huge. They have the resources to do that, but that's something everybody should probably keep in mind. I know.
No, I've had two people making excellent comments, so I don't think I have anything to add on top of that. So thank you.
Okay, that's great. Look, I'm conscious of time. I really think we could end up talking much further on this, and perhaps if I could ask our experts to keep a little bit of time in their diary for us in the future, because I think people are really interested in this topic. I think the requirements for public sector forecasting are many, and I think we would appreciate a kind of ongoing process of support and dialogue. So really a big thank you to our colleagues from all over the world for joining, and also our audience today. I'll hand over back to Rachel, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much for that, guys. I really enjoyed that, and I think we could have gone on. We've gone a little tiny weeny bit over time, but we don't mind. And you've done an excellent job of putting responses to people's queries in the chat. So you are the perfect speakers. So thanks very much for that. So I would just like to remind people, in case I haven't already made it quite clear, that this is the beginning of the rest of the conference. So the Health and Care Analytics Conference in Birmingham starts tomorrow and goes on until the end of Wednesday. And so if any of you out there are going to be turning up, it'll be great to see you. Come and find me. I've been trying to find ways of making myself stand out. This is not going to work. I know it's not, but maybe that, something like that. It'll be great to see you. If you're joining us online, then you are in for a treat as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Let's close it here. Bye-bye.